Hi, my name is Diego Roberto Bermudez. I am 32 years old. I am a crew member aboard the Spanish tall ship here called the Nao Trinidad. All right, we are from Spain. The ship is a replica of the 16th century ship that Ferdinand Magellan used to sail around the world. This ship would have led 4 other ships behind him, and for 3 years and 14 days, from 1519 to 1522, he completed the first circumnavigation around the entire planet. 34,000 nautical miles, it seemed, is what it took for him to sail across. This ship was built in 2018 in Huelva in Spain. She's 93 feet long, okay, overall, by 28 feet. She weighs 200 tons and draws about 10 feet. All right, this is our second or third time here in the United States that we have traveled across as a floating museum, offering deck tours for folks to come in and explore the decks of the ship. Below deck, you have a museum exhibition, as well as a video presentation that shows the construction of this ship. It took 14 months to build, and it is made mostly out of Iroko. Our story starts in 1517 with Ferdinand Megallan, who at this point was named Ferdinand Megallan. Okay, he was a Portuguese man who actually worked for several years underneath the Portuguese army. His relationship with the king at the time of Portugal, Manuel I, was very complicated. For whatever reason, it seemed that Manuel would not get along with Ferdinand Magellan after several attempts and proposals that were made by Magellan to explain that there was perhaps a western route to take on the Spice Islands. At this point in time, the Portuguese had a very large network of ports that they had explored in the late 15th century. And it was at this point that it seemed that the Spanish were getting ahead in this commercial race in order to see how many places they could colonize. Now, at this point in 1517, Magellan decides to give up his Spanish citizenship to then turn from Fernando Magallanes to Hernando Magallanes. He came up and approached the young Charles I, or at this point Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who was the king of Spain, and asked him at this point of whether he could take his ships with 260 men and sail around the world to bring him spices. They were not looking for gold, they were not looking for silver. They were looking for cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg from what they called the Molucca Islands, or what they called the islands of Malacca. Today we know those areas as being Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. In these areas they were looking for cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other spices they could bring back to Spain without them having to go through the trade routes of the Silk Roads. The ship that we have here of the Nao Trinidad, okay, was named after the ship that Ferdinand Magellan captained and commanded the entire Armada of Molucca fleet around the world. Nao Trinidad is basically broken down to the English translation of the ship Trinity. Trinidad being obviously the Holy Trinity of Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and now being the name of what these kinds of ships are. They're not galleons and they're not caravels. They're somewhere in between. These are the early cargo ships of the 16th century. About 100 years after this is when they would start to become the Spanish galleons. Okay, the Nao itself, okay, had a very long service career and were built as big as they could to transport cargo and merchandise. The supplies on board the Naos would be enough food, livestock, and supplies that would last them for a few months at a time. You're going to be looking at barrels of wine, you're going to be looking at hardtack, you're going to be looking at dry foods and stored salted fish that would last for months at a time. Okay, rum was used on these vessels. You would actually have Jerez or sherry wine that would be locked inside of these barrels that would last for months at a time. Of course, fresh water would be stored, but it was very, very challenging to keep it fresh. Most of that water would become stagnant, and vinegar would be added into the mix to try to keep away most of the algae growing inside. Inside of the holds, you would have had livestock, such as horses and pigs, that were brought by the Spanish in the 16th century. Welcome aboard. We are currently standing below deck inside of Nao Trinidad. Below here we have a museum exhibition where folks can come in and explore what is inside of this vessel. All right, this map that you see behind me is the world map of what the original route would have been taken in 1519 by Magellan and his 5 ships. They would have left Sevilla, okay, in 1519 and would have left around August and sailed all the way down to Cape Verde. Right in Cape Verde, they would have gotten their supplies and would have made the shortest route possible down into South America. From South America, they would take a saltwater test. They would test every bit of the shores in here and try to find a saltwater connection between the Atlantic and the next body of water, which was the Pacific. From here, they would have stayed close to 6 months to a year, right over here in Port St. Julian, okay? And then down here in Tierra del Fuego in Patagonia, they actually gave it the name of this territory because of the native indigenous folks that they encountered in this region. After 38 days of crossing through the Strait of Magellan, that was named very differently at that point because they had a different name for it, they came out and found the Pacific Ocean, okay? At this point, there were about 3 ships that had survived at this point. 1 actually returned back to Spain. And after the 3 ships of the Armada Maluca went and sailed 98 days across the entire Atlantic Ocean to then arriving into Guam. Once they arrived into Guam, they were very close into what they were called the Molucca Islands and the Spice Islands in this region. Okay? After several months of bouncing from island to island, they also went to Tidore, they went to Timor, and then they came to the Philippine Islands. Okay? Here in the Philippine Islands was unfortunately where, in the island of Cebu, in the Battle of Mactan, Ferdinand Megallan met his demise. He was fighting in the beach and was encountered by a group of native Indians that were led by Lapu-Lapu. Lapu-Lapu unfortunately killed him on the beach, and most of the crew fled and left. After that experience, the Trinidad tried to make a 6-month turnaround voyage around the Pacific to try to sail back to Spain, but after several headwinds and storms, they were too damaged and managed to sail all the way back to Tidore, where they started. Unfortunately, for the end of the Trinidad, of the 17 sailors that survived, most of them were unfortunately captured or killed by the Portuguese and couldn't keep up the ship and was lost due to time. So we'll probably never find the original vessel. That being said, the one ship that was at least at this point available was the Nao Victoria, which was captained by Basque pilot Juan Sebastián Elcano. Now, Juan Sebastián Elcano took his 16 and 17 men and sailed all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and made it all the way back 1 year later back into Cape Verde and all the way in September of 1522 into the Guadalquivir River into Sevilla. Okay? After sailing for 3 years and 14 days, having done 37,753 nautical miles, they arrived back to where they started, to everyone's surprise, but have the credit now of saying that they were the first sailors to circumnavigate the entire planet. They knew the world was round, but what they didn't know was they could sail it. And that's what we're here to celebrate. So what we have here is a description of what the crew would have consisted of in the year 1519 to 1522. You would have had cabin boys, you would have had apprentices, sailors, commanders, pilots, bosuns, and even up to the captain or the commander of the whole fleet. Ferdinand Magellan would have been at the top, and then below him would have been his officers. The officers would have then been responsible for the bosuns and the pilots, and below them would have been most of the crew below that. Here we're describing as to how difficult the conditions were in the 16th century. This was not a pleasure cruise. For many of these sailors, it was very tough living conditions due to lack of hygiene, lack of comforts that were here laid at home and on the ship. Being in these vessels was very, very hard work. All right. Many of these men, unfortunately, were succumbed to most diseases and to several common infections while being on board. They were not allowed to gamble. They were not allowed to swear. Many of these men had to make a good life for themselves while they were on board here for several years. All right. On this panel over here, what we have is a description of the technology of what most of these sailors would have used to navigate. What we're going to see here is, as a sextants, you're going to see an astrolabe. These are instruments that were used to measure the angle of stars, to find where the heavens were, to find out where they were in at this point in the world. Finding latitude was very easy at this point. If you found a point of reference, then you can measure where you were in the world. However, longitude itself was not discovered until the 18th century, once clocks were synchronized and we had a point of reference drawn inside of Greenwich in England, okay? So over here, what we have are these different instruments. The sextants would have measured the angle of different stars. The astrolabe would have measured the angle of the sun at a certain point. A hole would be drawn right through here that could measure the angle of the stars from the highest point of the ship, and a pilot or an astronomer would be able to measure from there. Using basic trigonometry, you could find your position in the world at that point. A chart of stars would be allowed for us to use this. There was no GPS and there was no Google Maps at this point. This was how they had to sail and how they had to find themselves in the world. But they were still struggling with the technology at that point to make sure that they could at least accurately find a way to come back home. What I have here in my hands is our steering mechanism. On board La Nao Trinidad in the 16th century, we didn't have steering wheels. What we had here are these sticks called whipstaffs. Consider this a vertical tiller, okay? This is a direct connection that drives all the way through the quarterdeck down to the main deck. Below here is a greasy ball joint that allows me to move this whipstaff, both port and starboard side, to allow me to have full access to move the tiller back and forth and create movement for our rudder to go from port to starboard. This technology did not change for 200 years. You would not see wheels until the mid-18th century. This is how we steered ships. If I pull to the port side, I'll let the ship drift into the port side. If I go here, then I'm going to start pulling to this direction. On a good day, 1 to 2 sailors is what it would take to steer this. On a bad day, 3 to 4. What we have here is the captain's cabin, all right? Ferdinand Magellan in 1519 was the only man who had access into these quarters. He would have had the one large space that would have allowed him to be cozy enough to keep on the expedition for around the Armada of Molucca. This space was only dedicated to Ferdinand Magellan and his scribe, Antonio Pigafetta. Antonio Pigafetta would have sat in this chair and would have documented most of the Magellan voyage throughout the expedition. After 3 years, a journal was published and was given to the Spanish government. But it was through this door right here where most of the world would have seen the voyage and the expedition ongoing. Inside, Ferdinand Magellan would have taken his watch leave and would have slept inside of these quarters. This would have been the one space that would have been accommodating just enough for him and really no one else. It was only him and his officers who had express permission to be inside of these quarters. Secret documents as well as maps of the time would have been kept inside of these quarters, away from the elements, and kept in a safe position. Behind me is what we consider the 16th century radio device for the Ferdinand Magellan and his fleet, okay? This lantern behind me would have had 5 candles inside of its case. Every single candle had a specific command. If all 5 candles were lit, a certain command would be meant to bring all the ships together. If one was lit, then it would continue on, okay? With that in mind, a candle could be seen from 3 to 4 miles out at sea. It was, in fact, illegal for several of these candles to be put out, all right? What we're standing on is the highest part of the ship, known as the poop deck, okay? This is not where sailors were to come to pooping, as most people think. The poop deck comes from the word pupis, which is the Latin word for la popa, what we call in Spanish as the highest part of a vessel, all right? From here, we would have been able to maneuver what we have is our lateen sail, or our mizzen mast, Okay, from here a triangular sail would have dropped and would have allowed us to continue on and sail with the trade winds to the next destination. Here what you see is what's known as la limera in Spanish. This is the rudder that is connected to our tiller. Below that is a wheel, okay, that moves the tiller from side to side, and then we have the whipstaff that is our vertical mechanism to move it and have mechanical advantage. Here in the 16th century, meals were prepared by lighting small fires on the main deck. The basic diet consisted of pound cake, legumes, salted meat and fish, dried fruits, vinegar, and wine. This map that we have here shows the pins of all the ports that we have visited over the last 5 years since the ship was constructed. In the last year that I've sailed with this ship, I have sailed as far north as the Great Lakes, as far south as the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and up the east coast of the United States. This summer, the Nao Trinidad has been spending its time in New England, bouncing between ports from Rhode Island all the way to Maine. So this is the end of our tour. thank you very much for exploring the decks of the 16th century ship of La Nao Trinidad. We hope to see you at the next port of call. And like always, fair winds and following seas.